Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Restless, the podcast. This is part 2 of Rogue Wave number 1, The Land of the Restless, featuring Dr. Lester Vogel. In this portion, we just jump right back into it with some questions and answer session with Dr. Vogel, with questions asked by myself, Steve, and Jared. Here we go.
Hey, Les, I know that some of these terms that you've been using, to me, they make a lot of sense because I've taken lots of classes with you, but they might not make as much sense to some of the listeners. I know, words like Torah and Talmud, they can sound very similar. I wonder if you could talk about that. And I know, also remember from a class you spoke about how some books of the Hebrew Bible are they come directly from God, whereas others are more man-made or come from man. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Okay, certainly. The nature, I think it's really the bigger topic is what is the nature of the Hebrew Bible? The Jews are very careful to distinguish between the Bible that they regard as their sacred books, and then Christians have what they call their Bible, which is an expansion based upon the life teachings of Jesus and the writings of various apostles. For Jews, the Bible is those scriptures that were originally written in Hebrew. They are the books that include the 5 books of Moses at the core. That is the central book, or really the central body of work that contains the various commandments, the history, the predictions of keeping to this relationship between the Jewish people and God, in terms of if you keep the relationship, that things will show, you will get rain in its time, your fields will produce enough food. Even something like the 7-year cycle of not planting would be something that would indicate that there is a period of time when those who produced the agricultural food of the country can stop for a year and they would still have enough, would be another indication of divine pleasure with the people. On the other hand, there is in the Bible instances where God tells the people, warns them that if you don't keep particular commandments, that you will be violating this contract that I, God, am creating with the Jewish people. And as a result of your not keeping the contract, there will be penalties to pay. And some of the predictions in the particular portions of the Bible are really horrific in nature, and they resonate in terms of Jewish history very sadly. It kind of makes me think that there was, I forgot the name of the French philosopher, who once, Louis the 14th asked for a proof from this French philosopher, proof of the existence of God. And the philosopher responded, the Jews, Your Majesty, the Jews are the proof of history, of the existence of God. Because this ancient text just has a narrative, and it just seemed to have played out historically, and seemed somewhat verified.
It just works.
Yeah. Maybe perhaps it was the philosopher was Descartes. I'm not sure. I can't say it. My mind
Rousseau?
No, not Rousseau.
No,
No,
okay.
it was. But in any event, this getting to your question about the
Origins.
inspired portions of the Bible, the God dictated portions of the Bible, those are the 4 books of Moses. And even in Judaism, one of the very famous commentators, Jewish commentators, was a person by the name of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who always went by the acronym Rashi. Rashi is a remarkable figure, lived in Provence in France, roughly around the year 1000, closer in that century. Rashi's commentary on the Torah, and Rashi commented on whatever it is almost that he could get his hands on. He had an amazing scope and knowledge of Judaism. In his comments are fundamental to understanding not only the Bible but also the Talmud and just the array of all these issues. Rashi questioned who wrote the very last lines of the Bible. Then was it Joshua who wrote them? And if so, was Joshua getting dictation from God like Moses had taken dictation? Or was it Joshua just sort of putting the codicil on the end of the Bible? Questions that got Rashi in hot water, at least with some of his other rabbis, because it tended to be, one has to believe that the Torah was dictated by God. For the rest of the Bible, the prophets, the various books of the prophets, and the books of the history of what happened to the various kings and so on, they have a sort of inspired element to them, particularly as recording the prophets. The prophets were supposedly people in touch with the divine will somehow or other, and whose job it was to convey that their knowledge of what was the divine will to the rulers. Sometimes they did it successfully and sometimes not. And there are other books, which in Hebrew are called the Ketuvim, which means literally the writings. They are the books of inspired writers, authors, some identified as works of David, for example, in the Psalms, some identified with Solomon, who was supposed to have authored Proverbs, for example, and other the Song of Songs, other inspired books, and some other kinds of specialized writings. Together as a whole, though, what Jews regard as their holy body corpus of texts is called another acronym, Tanakh. Tanakh is made up of the first letter of 3 different words: Torah, Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and Ketuvim. And the letter that is used for Ketuvim, although that sounds like a hard K, is also, in certain circumstances, pronounced as a more guttural sound. So that's the corpus of the Jewish Bible. Together with the Jewish Bible, there are other kinds of books, associated books, apocrypha books, which were or were not recognized in terms of the canon of Jewish literature. But probably the human masterwork, the piece of literature that Judaism is probably proudest of and has been probably for the last at least 1,700 years or so, the core that is studied more than anything, aside from the 5 books of Moses, is the Talmud. The Talmud is that record over a period of centuries of rabbinical discussions, arguments, opinions, stories, some fascinating stories of Jewish lore, of understandings of commandments from the Bible, of arguments over the nature of certain practices. Should or should not something be done? Is a particular thing correct in terms of Jewish law, or is it incorrect in terms of Jewish law? It's just a fascinating body of work. And it seems as if it is all sort of stream of consciousness, because you can begin one tractate on a clearly defined subject. For example, the practices that were done in the temple on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. And then all of a sudden, you're in the middle of a discussion about divorce issues or about issues of, is something permitted to be eaten or not? The range of thought is just so flexible and plastic and changes that it's just such a fascinating work to sit down and study. And it can never be done in one sitting, not at all. The nature of Talmudic study is one of understanding, but the best methodology for to reach that understanding is by studying with another individual and then basically discussing between the 2 or 3 of the individuals exactly what the arguments were, and then questioning, but perhaps something that particular rabbi didn't understand or get right, or ignored an opinion of something else, and following a stream of arguments that can be extremely intricate. There was I've mentioned this in class because it has been a remarkable modern phenomenon in Judaism. Jews have been studying Talmud for centuries. There were periods of time, unfortunately, when the Talmud was targeted under church auspices and burned, collected by figures and burned. It was a terrible loss of Talmudic works in Paris, for example, in the Middle Ages. But thankfully, because of the spread of Jews in different communities, it's always somewhat possible to put together the nature of the text. There have been tractates of the Talmud that have been lost. That people assume that there may be something on a particular topic. But the number of volumes of the Talmud, for example, I have at home, I have a set of the Talmud published it's in English and in Aramaic, which is the language of the Talmud. And of the 60-some tractates, my collection consists of almost 70 volumes on just 2 shelves of various tractates. And the thing that I mentioned, that something very remarkable that's very recent, back in the 1920s, there was the head of the Talmudic Academy in Lublin, which was among Jews very highly regarded. His name was Rabbi Meir Shapiro. And he had this idea that Jews were all studying Talmud, but you know, some here were studying about one holiday, another was studying laws of divorce, another was studying laws of sacrificial animals, and another about rules of what is kosher and what is not. And he had the idea that having everybody, all the Jews in the world who study Talmud, be on the same page at the same time. And so he started something which has become called Daf Yomi. The word Daf means a page, and Yomi means a day. So it's like a page a day. And this was back in the 20s. And the idea at first was resisted because the Talmud sometimes can be so dense you can spend days studying not even an entire page, but a quarter of a page. But his idea, after a while, took off, and actually coming up January 1st, I believe, it happens to be on January 1st, there is going to be another end of the cycle that began almost 7.5 years ago of the current page a day. And they're going to be massive celebrations. I went several years ago. It was one of my goals when I retired from working for the federal government that I spend time. I wanted to see what it was like to study Daf Yomi, and it just pulled me right in. It is just so fascinating. And in fact, I had gone through one cycle, and I remember attending a celebration at MetLife Stadium up in the Meadowlands of New Jersey. Thousands of people there. And it was really an amazing event. All of them had been there to celebrate the completion of the cycle. And in that same time, as this is a Jewish custom, they began the next cycle. So that happens every year. In fact, in terms of the Torah reading, the reading the Torah on a weekly basis is a fundamental part of Judaism. And every year, at the very last day of the holiday of Sukkot, that has a separate name called Simchat Torah, celebrating the Torah, the very last part of the section of the Torah is read, about the end of Moses' blessing to the people, and then basically his death and passing. And at the same time, after that is read, immediately after that portion is read, the very beginning of Genesis is started at that same celebration. And then, although that's done at that last day of the holiday, starting from Genesis is actually done again at the Sabbath of that, when that occurs right after that holiday. So it's continuous. It is. I wouldn't say it's an obsession, but there's a richness to the amount of information and the flexibility of the text to be inspirational, depending upon, the speaker, depending upon how knowledgeable that person, he or she is, and they're accessing various commentaries of which there are very, very. So,
Les, perhaps one of the Jared, something on your mind? Okay. It's been a great discussion with that. And one of the things that I think about is in that historical crossing over into the Promised Land. And it's almost geographically where Israel is today, minus somewhat of the territory. But why why that area? And I'm speaking as a physical geographer and a geologist, and from my background. But what about that region? What about that spot that God wanted them to settle there? The Jewish people to settle in that place. Some have said in the past it's because it's the center of the world.
In many ways, if you look at a globe, that strip of land, really at the far eastern end of the Mediterranean, is the only place where the Eurasian and African landmasses connect. There is a land bridge there, basically. That land bridge doesn't exist over at the other end of the Mediterranean, at the Straits of Gibraltar. There's a separation there. But that strip of land is basically a land bridge, has been a land bridge going back perhaps to the very beginning of humanity. In fact, some of the earliest Israeli archaeologists occasionally come up with findings in various caves, particularly in the Carmel region up north, of early humans who have migrated or heading north from Africa and into the Eurasian landmass. So it is very much so a key part, a key connection between a huge land portion of the earth. But also, having mentioned earlier about the nature of being in our agricultural societies way back in ancient times, that the importance of the availability of water for agriculture, though that issue was solved for people in Egypt with the Nile River overflowing on a predictable basis, and also for the people in Babylonia with the Tigris and Euphrates watering their area for agricultural purposes. So there was something regular in those areas. They didn't need to depend upon heaven for rain. But the area of the land of Israel did. It has very small water resources. You have the Sea of Galilee up in the north. You have even a little bit further up from that Mount Hermon, which has snow on it, and snow, if depending upon whether or not it's a rich snow winter or no snow winter, could or could not contribute to some of the availability of water. The Jordan itself is one of the people that in my book about Protestant Americans in the Holy Land in the 19th century, there's a very funny quote from Mark Twain, who, having been a Mississippi River pilot, just could not fathom what a little stream of water the Jordan River actually is. I think he made a remark to the effect that he felt sort of he was carrying this burden of assuming that the Jordan must have been 3 times the size of the Mississippi, and it was actually quite small, and still is today. But there's something fascinating about the geography of the country, because what you have at one end, at the western end of the country, along the seacoast, is an area that rises slowly and then becomes a mountainous spine down the middle of the country. Jerusalem is part of that spine, and it continues down all the way from the area of Samaria and down to Hebron. But then after that mountain, that central spine, the earth seems to just drop off, particularly from Jerusalem on down. When you're looking at the Dead Sea, my daughter lives, from where she lives, if you step out of her front door and turn to the left, you can see the back of the Mount of Olives. And if you look in the other direction, on a good day, if the air is clear, or in the evening if the air is clear, you can see not only the hills on the other side of the Jordan River, the mountains, but you can also see sometimes the lights of Amman, Jordan, from her front door. So it's extremely compressed, very, very compressed.
And that might be hard for us to understand as Americans who have this vast wilderness to the west. And
Yeah.
so we think of it that way. And what you're saying is it's a whole lot more compressed than you might think.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. To travel from the north all the way down to, for example, Eilat, the very southern part where the Red Sea comes up. Probably you can do that in 3-4 hours or so in a drive. And part of that drive is only because some of the roads in the south are still single lane, or used to be anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it's extremely compressed, but it's a fascinating area, though. When you drive down to the Dead Sea, you're driving through the Judean desert, and it is just, call it mystical, but it is an amazing sight to see. Just the rolling hills with no vegetation on them at all. And then scattered Bedouin encampments around different locations. It's just fascinating. And then once you get down to the Dead Sea area, you're on a plain, and you have walls of mountains on both sides in the Jordan Rift Valley, which is the deepest part in the surface of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It's just fascinating to see.
And often when you read the writers of the Hebrew Bible, particularly when we get into Psalms, the visionary things and the imagery that, say, the writer of Psalms was, which I would assume would be David, perhaps?
Perhaps, yeah.
When he speaks of green pastures and quiet
Mm-hmm.
waters,
Mm-hmm.
when we as Americans read that, maybe it's not the same image that that shepherd was seeing at that time. I mean, we think of green pastures, we think of these lush green cattle-fed pastures, and the still waters, this babbling brook of peace and things like that. That's not the story, is that?
Not necessarily, no, because you're talking. It's interesting. During a recent visit, I was there with visiting my daughter and her sister and her family also at the same time, and we took a trip down to a place called Ein-Gedi. Ein-Gedi was a site mentioned as being one of the hiding places of David when he was being pursued by Saul. And when you're there, you get some idea, because you're in extremely rough territory. There are rocks strewn around. The general color of the landscape is tan or reddish in places, and very, very rugged. Some vegetation, but not too much. But where you find the vegetation, it's overgrown, and it's very rich. For example, in the wadi of Ein-Gedi, which is fed by one of the streams coming off of the desert, there are a series of waterfalls, which are a delight to go climb up, and kids really enjoy playing in them. But you can see how, in a landscape that is so sparse, how something like finding water and some vegetation can just be almost miraculous, and how a poet would be inspired to make something more of it than just a place to just sit down and drink.
That's so neat. And even I think as you spoke regarding Mark Twain,
Mhm.
his visit at the turn of the century was one that was
He went in after the Civil War.
right. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
and he referred to it as a vast wasteland or a very dry place. And
Yeah.
yet today you look at it from satellite images, and it's perhaps one of the greenest places in the region. What's happening there?
It probably the best explanation would be the repopulation of the country under the auspices or under the movement, the political movement called Zionism. The idea, which grew out of the 19th century, really, that it was time for Jews to take control of their affairs, particularly in those Jews living in poverty in the Russian Empire, which at times was extremely anti-Semitic, that it was time for Jews to take control and move back and perhaps see if there was a way that they could make a living in what had been the ancient homeland. Some of that effort it was very tenuous until after the First World War, when the British took control. And then by that time, there was an awareness of among the Arab population of their political aspiration. And that's where you began to have the nature of a conflict that still exists today, unfortunately. But the efforts that were put out by the Jews in terms of building the country, of developing the land, it was not one of doing so for to take advantage of the land. It was one for the regeneration of the Jewish soul, which had basically endured the persecutions in Eastern Europe and in other places. And then with the 30s and 40s, the persecutions and the people getting out of Germany, and then after the war, those survivors of the Holocaust who could make it to the country. The tales of people's survival and return, each person seems to have their own tale, and they are extremely moving.
Thank you for listening to Part 2 of Rogue Wave number 1, The Land of the Restless, featuring Dr. Lester Vogel. We really hope that you've enjoyed this departure from the norm here on Restless the podcast. But don't worry, as our episodic content featuring people's stories will also be returning, though we do hope to have more Rogue Waves to continue to explore other topics relevant to the restless nature of the human heart. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll be seeing you soon.
When I'm broken to pieces, you make me whole, and through every season, you're mending my soul.